we're back on Step Into the Story for a really special show today. I'm Donna Allward. I'm here with my co-host Barbara Wallace. And then we've got, it's like old home week. We've got two of the founding members back today. Renee's back with us again. And Julia's here to talk about her new book, The Lost English Girl.
Hi.
Welcome back, Julia.
Oh, thank you so much. It's lovely to be back.
So we've all read this book already. What's your release date?
It is the 7th of March. So,
right. So
it'll be out by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
Right. And we got advanced copies. And which, thank you so much. We all agree that this is like your best one yet.
Oh, thank you.
We really loved it. So before we launch in, why don't you tell us a little bit about what The Lost English Girl is about and show us your beautiful book.
Yes. So this is The Lost English Girl, which has one of my favorite covers. I've been very, very lucky with book covers. So this is a book I like to say sort of the jumping off point is a true story, but the story itself is all fictional. So there's a family legend in on my mother's side of the family that she had an aunt who got pregnant out of wedlock and was forced to marry the young man. And they were separated on their wedding day and never saw each other again. And the reason was that she was Catholic and he was Jewish. And at the time, the families did not believe that was something that should be allowed to go forward. But the legitimacy of the child was the most important thing to these families. So I, being an author, of course, had tons of questions that nobody could answer because the people involved have long since died. And so I thought, well, what would happen if I started a book with a character? My character Viv is a young Catholic woman who is pregnant out of wedlock, and her husband-to-be is a young Jewish man. They marry, and circumstances mean that they are separated on their wedding day. And what happens after that? So this is the big what if question that authors sometimes ask themselves. And sometimes that becomes an entire book. So in Viv's case, the story then moves forward to World War II. It's the eve of World War II, and she is faced with the decision to keep her daughter with her in Liverpool or send her away to the countryside as part of the mass evacuations that were going on. And circumstances, again, mean that the decision is sort of made for Viv. So it goes through her story and her daughter's story. And then on Joshua's side, we have the story of him coming back to Britain from New York. He's been a jazz musician working in New York, and basically his decision and how that leads him back into life with his family, life in Britain, and also causes him to reevaluate some of the decisions he's made in the past as well. So it's a book about family and forgiveness and possibly reconciliation as well as some of these incredibly difficult decisions that people had to make during the war.
Yeah. So is it my turn? Because I have this wonderful question.
It is.
First of all, so good to see you again, Julia. So
it's good to see you too.
I love The Last Dance of the Debutante, as you know, and that was sort of a very glamorous book with death and ball gowns and the Queen even and cocktail parties and 1950s. But this book is really different. It's set in Liverpool with the mother and daughter sort of navigating the trials of war and evacuation. But it seems the thread that I kind of noticed in the two books is that complex mother-daughter relationship. And that kind of seems to be the core of both stories. So how did you, I'm sorry, I saw the tail.
With feline visitor.
Okay, back to our episode.
Yes.
So how did you creatively transition from one book to the next while still kind of keeping that theme? And what is it about that theme that keeps coming up and draws you in?
Well, I think there are a few things going on. With any book that I write, I'm always interested in women who take slightly different paths than what might be expected for them. Sort of these women who either are living on or interacting with sort of the fringes of society or societal expectations. So in the case of the debutantes, it's a woman who's kind of stuck between tradition and modernity and, deciding what the right path for her is and how to, honor her family, but also honor what it is that she wants. In this book, ironically, that's also a theme in a way, less so with modernity, but, making the decision between family and tradition, and in this case, faith, as well, because that drives all of the decisions that Viv's parents make as well. They're very their position in the community and their position within their church and in their relationship with their priest is incredibly important to them. And so she's making that decision, and then also deciding, how does she create her life for herself? And, one of the things that I always love doing throughout any book is taking a woman on a journey from where she is at the beginning, bringing her to a completely different place in the end. And even if that's just not necessarily a physical place, but an emotional place, sort of having these coming of age moments, even if the characters are not, teenagers, they have this emotional growth and go through this process. And so I think with any of my books, I'm trying to maybe open the world up a little bit to some of these characters. And sometimes, unfortunately, in some families, the draw of trying to kind of keep you within the safe and keep you within what is known can sometimes pull these characters back and hold them back. So in the case of both Debutante and The Last Dance of the Debutante and The Lost English Girl, which I have to be very careful when I say those two titles because there's so many L's in there. But with the Lost English Girl as well, you have two mothers who think they're really doing the right thing. They're trying to keep their daughters safe, and their daughters are trying to push against that and sort of break away from that.
Yeah. Love that. I really do.
I have to say that you excel at taking a character and giving her a backbone by the end of the book.
Thank you.
I think you do great with that. And it's one of the things I know, like I was texting them at the beginning going, there's a couple characters you really, really want to slap.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was writing that. And I'm like, I can't wait to the part where she gets her backbone. Because I knew it was good. You're so good at doing that and showing the growth like in increments as opposed to like this overnight transformation. And I loved it.
Thank you.
I actually really like the book because as a Catholic, I'm Catholic. My brother is in a marriage with a Jewish woman. So we have an interfaith marriage in our family, and the whole balancing of the different holidays and stuff took a little while to get used to. So it was interesting reading all the anti-Semitism that was going on. It was very infuriating on their behalf.
Absolutely.
No, but I did have a question. It's more of an author question because you had this great, the storyline is fantastic, but you ended up putting in a second timeline, which is very small. And I'm curious what made you stick that little tiny one in, because while it was interesting, I don't think the book needed it. The overall story was so strong without it and self-explanatory. So I was curious what decision you made to throw that in as a writer.
Is this the initial meeting time when Viv and Joshua meet? Yeah. So I wanted to, first of all, I'm a sucker for playing with timelines and narrative, and I really enjoy doing that. So any opportunity I can, I will admit that I do it sometimes just for my own interest. But I wanted to answer one of the big questions for me, which again, we don't know the answer to any of these questions in terms of my relative and what happened with her, but we literally don't know if this was the love of her life or just a boy who she made a decision and had a passing fling with. And so I wanted to explore what would happen if sort of one of the biggest decisions in your life that has shaped every aspect of your life happened with somebody you really don't know very well. So there's this kind of, both of these characters are sort of drawn to each other and attracted to each other. But it's not like this is this burning passion between the two of them when they first meet and they get pregnant. And so having that have this longer impact on their lives, I thought would be an interesting thing to explore. And also to give some of the background of, I really wanted to make sure that in writing this book, and I hope this came through, that this was not Viv is the victim of a guy who went out and went after her and, right. He got her pregnant and then he left her. That's not the case. There's two sides of this story. There's mutual attraction. There's mutual decisions being made. And so I wanted to use that timeline to kind of build out some of that and play around with sort of giving some motivation and some emotion to both of them. Because, obviously very focused on her. I'm a female author writing predominantly about women, but I also wanted to write about him and sort of how shocking and how complex that would have made his own life decisions. So Joshua, I think, has even more growing than Viv does throughout the course of this book. And I think that really starts in 1934, 1935 with with that secondary timeline.
Yeah, I was actually really glad you did his point of view too, because I think without it, he would come across much differently. But he's very sympathetic, despite the choices he makes. He makes some bad choices, but
Yeah.
he's very sympathetic because you can understand, and they're young, and you get that across.
Very.
They're only 18, 19 years old when all this is happening.
Absolutely. And, and she makes some bad decisions too. I mean, she's not by any means blameless in this. I think everybody is trying to do what they think is right. Even the characters that you want to slap throughout, especially those beginning chapters, which I think always makes for a more interesting book, because rather than having sort of a mustache twirling villain, you have somebody who you can sit there and you can say to yourself, I don't agree with anything that this person is doing throughout the course of this book, but at least I understand where their motivation comes from, even if I find it, difficult to even reconcile with their character.
I do find in the book that I'm revising right now, I have a slightly similar situation in because the heroine gets pregnant very early on, and it's hard if especially in that time period where sex is a huge deal, that you really have to make sure that you nail why they would your heroine would sleep with someone they barely knew. And so building that out and the motivations behind it, whether it's rebellion, whether it's reaction to something else, whatever that motivation is, it kind of has to be there. So I'm finding I'm going through having to layer in more motivation, and I've had to add one or two, just building up to that. Not in a separate timeline because it happens at the beginning of the story, so it's fine. But I do find that if you hadn't done that, then it would have been well, why did Viv have sex with someone she didn't really know, right?
Yeah, especially being raised in a very strict Catholic family,
Right.
and I'll say I have some family members who may not be so wild about this, but it was not just this one relative I had who had this happen. It was not that uncommon for women to get married very, very quickly because they had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. I think part of that is human nature and human impulse, especially with people who are, we now know their brains are not fully developed because they're still growing and still developing. But also, people who have been told all their lives what to do. And I think in Viv's case, there is the sense of somebody who isn't appropriate according to her family and who isn't the boy that she's supposed to marry. And, she doesn't think that she's going to get pregnant. She doesn't think that this is what's going to happen, but, isn't it her chance to just, experience something outside of the realm of what's expected for her for the first time.
I like that you didn't romanticize it either.
No.
Because once it happened, that was it. They actually didn't see each other again until she found out. And it's it's
but it was very realistic because we've all been teenagers and teenage hormones, and there is the idea of
awkward.
What?
It's awkward after, it gets awkward.
Yeah, we've all been where we've been attracted to someone specifically because we know it would tick off our parents.
Absolutely.
And we may not have gone as far as sleeping with and marrying the boy, but everyone has their moment of rebellion because that's normal. And again, I go back to their teenagers, and that everything they did was typical teenager. Yeah. It's just
absolutely
there were much bigger ramifications in 1934 than there were now. And I think you're right. There are probably a lot of girls and boys who, I know we have a great aunt in our family who did the same thing, who went on a trip for several months and then came back.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
So, Julia, I just wanted to ask you, because now that we're kind of talking about those strict religious upbringings, I really wanted to ask you for your research, because you and I have had this conversation where sometimes we have to remember to put the mores of the time period in our books and not try and throw in our personal religious decisions and what we think. And so how did you I just am really interested how did you sort of dig into the Jewish faith in Britain at the time, and then the Catholic faith at Britain at the time? Because I feel like it was so baked into the characters, as opposed to a lot of times, especially when I read inspirational books, that are very heavy and evangelistically heavy, they tend to want to put modern day preaching in. So just kind of walk us through how you went about your research to bake that faith into these characters.
Well, thank you for asking that, actually. I'm not religious myself. I describe myself as non-religious, but I am from a family that has traditionally been Catholic on one side and vehemently atheist on the other. So it's a really fun mixed bag of things going on there. But when it comes to the Catholic side, I was very fortunate. I was able to talk to my mother a lot about, what was it like growing up in this community? What was it like growing up with the family priest coming over, or the parish priest coming over? And you would get out the best china, and it would be a big deal if the priest came and had, Sunday lunch with you after Mass, and how much of your life was dictated by sort of when you worshiped, how you worshiped, the community that you were in, So we talked a lot about that because the church is not the same, and there are bits and pieces that are different. But a lot of that on Viv's side is very much based on sort of my mother and my aunts and uncles talking to me about what it was like living then. So I was very fortunate in having sort of a great research resource there. When it came to the Jewish faith, I was very fortunate in that I had a couple of academics who, including a gentleman named Dr. Tony Kushner, who were very, very generous with their time and very willing to talk to me and kind of ground me in what would Liverpool have been like during this time. So, for instance, there weren't at that point in time necessarily sort of separate neighborhoods in the way that you see in other cities that are traditionally very Jewish or traditionally very Catholic. Liverpool was much more sort of integrated and mixed in. So you had people living next door to each other who might have been of different faiths. Now, Liverpool was predominantly Catholic during this time and still is a very Catholic city in a lot of ways. But that really helped kind of give some context to the setting and also the people who would have had interactions. So if you had, anti-Semitism, which does come up in this book, in a way it's sort of casual and it's thrown in, as opposed to, these people are all living in this one community and you don't go there and you don't interact. It's a different, it's different in a lot of ways. And then I also had a wonderful sensitivity reader, a couple wonderful sensitivity readers, but in particular, my former editor, Marla Daniels, did a sensitivity read for me and really helped get aspects of practice and custom and sort of the way that family would talk to each other correct. And one of the parts that I found the most rewarding to write was the family sits Shiva at one point, which is something that I've never done myself, but I knew about from friends and family members who've done this before. And so going through and sort of understanding why people do certain things, how a character like Viv, who is entering into this world as a Catholic woman, entering into a house that is performing this custom that's unfamiliar to her, might have seen it, but then also might have been very open to it. That was a really, really important thing for me to try to get right. So any mistakes are my own, but I had wonderful, wonderful assistance along the way to try to help me out on both sides with both faiths and with those depictions.
Well, it's very realistic. So you definitely nailed it. I was impressed.
Thank you.
That was the part where I cried.
Yes, you messaged me and said I had made you cry. I'm so sorry.
No, don't be sorry. That's awesome.
I think I texted and said, there better be another twist.
Yeah, it's like
there's so much book to go.
Right? And I was like, oh man, that just happened. And I was weepy.
Mm-hmm.
So I gotta say, I had like 3 questions written down, and y'all have covered them all.
Oh, they poached you.
I do have, and we'll have to be careful with this because we don't want to spoil the ending.
Yeah, it's tricky.
But I do have. Before that, I want to say that I'm going to piggyback on what Barb said about the character arc and women with a backbone, because we saw it in Viv, and Joshua's sister always sort of had a backbone, and she actually came to mellow out a little bit.
Yeah,
but then Viv's sister, there was one scene where she basically tells Viv to sort of, if you don't like it, then change it. You know what I mean? And I really loved that strong yet loving response, from her, and how, she, despite some of the mistakes that were made, she really did always have Viv's back. So I really like those character arcs. It is something you do really well. Is
Thank you.
bringing those women up and then having them have that defining moment where, they really sort of stand up for themselves.
And Joshua too. His arc was very strong, and
Thank you.
he grew more and more sympathetic as the book went along.
Yeah, and then when he finally, he just, for such a long time, he just doesn't get it, and then and so that's really rewarding. So I will say,
really realistic. He was a realistic not getting it.
Yeah, and
that makes sense.
But your character arcs are really rewarding. So I appreciate.
Thank you.
The other thing is, there was, when it comes to the ending, and again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but so what really happened, and Viv and Joshua find this out. I actually thought it was going to go in a different direction, with how it happened being different. So did you always know that that's how it was going to end, I guess is my question. Did you always know that was the reasoning behind it, or that those players involved?
So I rewrote the last 2/3 of this book. I turned it in, knowing it was a mess, knowing it was about 50,000 words too long. I had to go through some stuff, apparently, to write that book. But, I knew that there were issues with it. And one of the issues was, again, you have to be very careful to avoid spoilers here.
Sorry.
So no, but basically I had put the book so that it was set in 1961 in the last part of it.
Oh.
And so the characters have gone through a very different path and very different life. And actually I was laughing when you were saying Joshua's sister mellows. You see her in her mellowing in that, other parallel universe version of this book that kept the 1961 side. And I just knew it wasn't working. But the one thing that I really wanted to do was to bring that final conclusion and reconciliation about for the same reason. So the reasoning kind of remained the same. Some of the logistics and how things came about changed. But really what ended up happening was I ended up moving the end of the book to just after the war, so just after VE Day, and Joshua's been demobbed, and a thing happens that kind of makes Viv realize that she may not know the entire story about what happened to her daughter during the war. And so all of that had to get changed, obviously, for this new thing. But you're speaking so carefully here, but I really, this is good practice though.
Talking about by Julia's book.
I know, exactly. But the sort of the seeking out what happened, it was still always going to end in the way that it ended. How they got there and sort of the aftermath changed a little bit. And that aftermath came about because I became particularly interested in a book by Juliet Summers. I think I reference in the author's note. So if you're interested, once you finish the book, you can read about it in the author's note. And sort of that ended up coloring a lot of what I ended up doing. And I think the rewrite is dramatically benefited from that really dramatically in the end. But it took me a while to get there. Somewhat like that answer, which I feel like I've danced around.
No, but I will tell you too that again, I'm in the middle of massive revisions, so it's really nice to know that that you also had the same pain.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and also I'm very much too long. So, all right. So I think we've covered our questions for today, but our big final question is, what do you have coming next? I know you've got a new podcast on the go with the history quill, right? So you can tell us a little about that, and then tell us a bit about what you're working on book-wise.
So the History Cruel podcast is a podcast mostly meant for historical fiction writers aspiring and authors who are in the process of publishing. But of course, anybody is more than welcome to listen along. And people may actually be particularly interested because the first episode will be with Madeline Martin, who wrote The Librarian Spy and The Last Bookshop in London, and I know is a friend of this podcast and a friend of ours. Or a friend of this Facebook Live. And so that's been a lot of fun getting that off the ground and launched after a lot of sort of meetings and planning in the background and not being able to talk about it. I can finally talk about it now. So that comes out at the end of March. In terms of what I'm writing right now, what I'm working on, I have something that I can't really talk about and something I can talk about. So what I can't really talk about is I am working on another book for 2024 and talk about the sort of drafting and rewriting process. Earlier today, I was actually taking a look over what I'd written already and thinking, I'm not sure this is working. So I'm back to the drawing board with a couple of aspects of it, but that is with any luck going to be wrapped up here in the next couple of months, and then I'll have a title and a cover and all of that I can share more widely. But in October, I have the first of a historical mystery series coming out. So this is a first for me. It's called A Traitor in Whitehall, and it's the beginning of my Evelyn Redfern series. So it's World War II, amateur sleuth, first person, very voicey, and it's set in Churchill's Cabinet War Rooms, which you can actually visit now in London. It's a museum now, but it was sort of the central hub of the war, not the war effort, the government and all of the military effort that was going on during the war. And being a mystery novel, a murder happens in the middle of it, and my sleuth has to go through and figure out what has happened. So I'm really excited for that book to come out as well.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one because I love voicey stuff. Yeah.
It'll be fun. It's very different.
So there's more coming, right, Julia, in that series? Or is it a 3-part series, or you're just going to keep writing until they say no?
I will happily keep writing until they say no. There are 3 books on the deck for it. So I have to write the second book, and I say have to write. I am very much looking forward to writing the second book in the spring here. So it's a busy writing year for me.
Yeah.
It sounds a little like, was it Susan McNeil's books? Is that?
She very kindly provided a cover blurb for the book, actually, which I was delighted with.
A lot of fun. So if it's like that, people are going to really love it.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope there'll be some, familiarity with the setting and also with that sort of area of historical mystery in World War II.
Awesome. Really awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really lovely to have the gang back together, or at least some of the gang. Now we're going to have Madeline back on.
I know.
Right?
I know.
We'll have Madeline and Eliza on, and then you and I will take the weekend off.
That's it. That's do it.
And Piper, don't forget Piper. She was amazing.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. And Piper. That's right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And right. And so next week on the 21st, we have Noelle Salazar coming to visit us, and we're going to talk about Angels of the Resistance. So for those of you watching today, come back next week, 7 p.m. Eastern on the 21st for that. And otherwise, that's it for us for today.
Go out and buy the Lost English Girl. Don Shell.
Yes.
Go get it. Go
next Tuesday.
You just keep getting better and better.
And then you'll know.
Thank you so much.
During the ending. Yeah,
exactly.
Every single book I've loved more.
Thank you.
All right.
I appreciate that.
Thanks for joining us, Julia.
Thanks, everybody.